and welcome to another episode of It's a History Podcast. I'm your host, Madison, and this week we'll be continuing our coverage on George Washington. Last week we looked at why George Washington was elected the first president of the United States. This week we will be looking at Washington's relationship with slavery. Both George and Martha had inherited enslaved people from family members. I will also be looking at George's personal thoughts on slavery, as well as different laws and acts that came about during his lifetime, and particularly after the official start of the United States being an independent country. To put this episode into some sort of perspective for you, the listener, I will be discussing the Washingtons and slavery in more broad terms. This is a at most 20-minute episode of a podcast that I can say with certainty that the history and generational impact of slavery cannot be discussed thoroughly within the time frame. I should also mention that I am a 20-something white woman doing a history podcast who is doing her very best to give this topic the respect it deserves. When we learned about the founding fathers in school, I do not recall ever knowing that they were slaveholders. That is not something I learned until either late high school in class or on my own accord. There was no emphasis on this part of history. I find that it is hard for some people to acknowledge that many people from the past, even those who have important and historic impact on our nation, can also have parts of them that are reprehensible. It's hard to place George Washington, the first president of the United States, a founding father, into the same category as plantation owners and slaveholders, but that's who he was. He was a very wealthy and successful plantation owner, and that was largely through the use of slave labor. Being a wealthy, prominent man in Virginia was one of the things working for him when it came to the question of who will lead this nation of ours. What was the state of slavery during the Revolutionary period? During the Revolutionary period, plantation farming of tobacco, rice, and indigo made up a large portion of the U.S. economy. Before the Revolution, debates began to arise on the abolition of slavery. Some northern states, such as Vermont and Pennsylvania, gradually abolished slavery, but these new laws only emancipated newly born children of enslaved women. Slavery was maintained as the U.S. went from colonies to its own country. In the Constitution, slavery was mentioned when it was determined that 3 out of every 5 enslaved people were counted when determining a state's population for taxation and congressional representation reasons. It would not be until Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation that all slaves would be freed. Between the Revolution and the Civil War, any freedoms awarded to enslaved people were piecemeal legislation passed over the years within different states. How did the Washingtons get involved with slavery? To begin this saga, we need to look back at George's childhood. His father had passed away when George was just 11 years old. And with that, he inherited 10 enslaved people through his father's estate. He would later go on to inherit, purchase, rent, and gain control of more than 500 enslaved people over the course of his life. Martha, who was originally married to Daniel Parke Custis, had a much larger holding of enslaved people. As an older teenager, Martha caught the eye of a 20 years her senior, Daniel. Daniel's father originally was opposed to this marriage as Martha's family was not as wealthy as he would have preferred, but he finally caved after meeting Martha himself. After marrying on May 15, 1750, Martha moved into Daniel's home, known as White House, a little on the nose there. The death of Daniel's father the previous November meant that Daniel was now one of the wealthiest men in Virginia. The Custis holdings were immense, nothing like what Martha had grown up with. Daniel's wealth consisted of almost 300 slaves and over 17,500 acres of land. Martha had climbed many steps of the social ladder and was now in one of the highest echelons of Virginia society. Of the 300 enslaved people, Martha oversaw 12 within the scope of domestic chores and housework, as well as a maid and eventual nanny when she had her children. Martha would have 4 children in total: Daniel Parke Custis, Francis Parke Custis, John Parke Custis, and Martha Parke Custis. Unfortunately, Martha's first 2 children would both pass before the age of 5. Parke was a family name that the children's great-grandfather imposed be in their given name if they were to receive a portion of the familial estate. At the age of 26, Martha was widowed after Daniel suddenly became ill and died. Daniel had died without a will, which meant that Martha would be the executor of his estate. She could buy and sell land herself, make contracts, and handle the money. George, on the other hand, had inherited the 2,000-acre Mount Vernon when his half-brother Lawrence had died. Upon their marriage, their estates merged. George Washington would have been responsible for all the enslaved people he already owned, as well as the population of enslaved people Martha brought into the marriage. The land, enslaved people, and money from the Custis family would be handed down to the Custis heirs after Martha died. At the end of Washington's life, up to 40% of the population was made up of enslaved people. The laws at the time stated that slaves were property, not people. Enslavement was permanent, and it was hereditary. Enslaved people had no legal rights, and they could not legally marry. Most would have never had the opportunity to become literate and left no written documents. How did George Washington feel about slavery? It seems silly to think about how someone who clearly benefited from slavery felt about the institution, but George Washington was a highly influential man during his time. It most definitely mattered what he thought of slavery. As a young man, like most young people, his thoughts were heavily influenced by his family and surrounding community. At this time, he accepted slavery as it was. It wasn't until after the Revolutionary War that he began to question the institution. Throughout the 1780s and 90s, Washington stated privately that he no longer wanted to be a slave owner. He no longer wanted to buy and sell slaves or separate enslaved families. He also stated that he supported a plan for gradual abolition in the United States. He never addressed these thoughts publicly, especially when he was president, as he believed that the debates over slavery could tear the new nation apart. He was not wrong. The Civil War happened just shy of 80 years after the end of the Revolution, just one lifetime away. For Washington, his objection to slavery can be divided into those related to money and those related to morality. When it came to profits, Washington found that he was running Mount Vernon at a loss. The profits he made from plantation farming were not enough to cover the cost of feeding, clothing, and housing hundreds of enslaved people, and these were bare minimum costs. Standard slave quarters were rudimentary one-room log structures with a wooden chimney or barrack-style quarters. Food consisted mainly of cornmeal and salted fish. Some enslaved people would keep gardens, raise poultry, or forage for themselves. Clothing would consist of coarse linens for field workers, which would be worn daily. Men would be given one wool jacket, one pair of wool breeches, 2 linen shirts, 1 or 2 pairs of stockings, 1 pair of shoes, and linen breeches for summer. Women would be given 1 wool jacket, 1 wool skirt, 2 linen shifts, 1 pair of stockings, 1 pair of shoes, and 1 linen skirt for summer. This clothing was made at Mount Vernon by other enslaved people. When it came to morality, Washington was surrounded by many different ideas. Some abolitionists at the time were influenced by the Enlightenment, which promoted liberty and equality. Others were influenced by religious convictions. Washington himself was also surrounded by individuals that opposed slavery. John Lawrence and Marquis de Lafayette, to name a couple. Lafayette had asked Washington to purchase a Caribbean plantation and free its slaves with him. Washington declined the offer but praised the idea. John Lawrence had developed a plan to recruit and free a regiment of slaves from South Carolina. Washington once again approved of the idea, but state legislature rejected the idea due to fears of a slave rebellion. As the leader of the newly minted United States of America, Washington threaded the needle very carefully. His ultimate priority was national unity. With his fears already mentioned, anything he did for the country was done with the goal of maintaining a single United States. This priority of national unity superseded his thoughts on abolition. How did Martha feel about slavery? In short, Martha did not have the same feelings towards slavery as her husband. Her actions throughout her life suggest that she did not question the morality of slavery like George did. Martha, having been a woman born into Virginia elite society and marrying her way up, had been surrounded by enslaved people her entire life. She inherited 1/3 of the Custis estate, which included 84 slaves. They could not be legally freed or sold, as they were a part of the Custis estate and not Martha's herself. Martha did choose to free George's slaves prior to her death, as she was uncomfortable with her death being the catalyst for a population's freedom. Upon her own death, Martha had decided to leave the only slave she owned herself to her grandson instead of following in George's footsteps and free him. How was George Washington impacted by enslaved people personally? Washington was impacted by enslaved people over the course of his life. Phyllis Wheatley, a talented poet, who one of my favorite podcasts, History Chicks, has covered quite well, sent Washington a poem in 1775 that celebrated his leadership and accomplishments. He invited her to visit his headquarters in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It is possible that Washington was inspired by Wheatley when he urged education for former slaves. William Lee, Washington's enslaved valet, rode beside Washington and was responsible for his personal gear and equipment during the Revolution. The two men were close, and Lee was the only enslaved person that was freed immediately in 1799 by Washington's will. It wasn't until his death that Washington made any public statement in regard to slavery. In his will, he stated that his 123 enslaved workers would be freed after Martha's death. This would apply to fewer than half of the enslaved workers at Mount Vernon. Anyone who was owned not by the Washington estate but by the Custis estate, which was the estate of Martha's first husband and of her children. All of the Custis enslaved workers were to be inherited by Martha Washington's grandchildren after her death. Washington had hoped to avoid separating enslaved families, but knowing that many families on the Mount Vernon plantation were of both his own slaves and those of the Custis estate, he knew that his act of freeing his slaves would ultimately end up separating families. He did not have the legal authority to free any of the Custis slaves. This was complicated for the enslaved people of the Custis Washington estate. Many of these people had lived together for years, forming relationships and having families. This was a bag of mixed emotions, as some were to be newly freed while others were to continue on as an enslaved worker for what would most likely be the rest of their lives. They were not left to Martha's children. They were left to her grandchildren, which, just based on age, would mean that anyone left to the grandchildren would be with them until the end. If you ever have the time, I would highly suggest visiting the George Washington's Mount Vernon website. They have a page dedicated to individual enslaved people that lived on the Custis, Washington estate. Each person has a description of what their work assignment would have been at the time of Washington's death. There is also historically accurate silhouettes for each person who received a biography based on historical records of their physical description, historically accurate clothing for the time, as well as clothing specific to their work assignment. I'm going to go over 3 of the individuals highlighted on this website, but like I said before, you should really go look at this portion of the website if you can. The first person I will highlight will be Kate. Kate was a field worker who later became the midwife for the estate. Her husband, Will, who was an enslaved overseer, approached George with a request from his wife. Instead of hiring out midwifery services by a paid white woman, his wife, Kate, could do the job instead. This would allow children to be born not with the assistance of an outsider, a stranger, but by someone that the woman would have been familiar with. Kate had lost her own son William in 1792 due to an illness. William had felt a sharp pain in his back and soon became very ill. Kate cared for him over the next week in her cabin, and a white doctor was even sent for. But William did unfortunately pass shortly after. It is not the pain and anguish a grieving mother and father would have experienced that was recorded, but instead a comment from Washington in which he stated, "His death I much regret because he was a promising boy." Upon Washington's death, Kate was freed along with her 3 living children, Molly, Virgin, and Kate, while her husband Will was a part of the Custis estate and would have remained enslaved. The second person I will highlight will be Davy Gray. Davy Gray originally came to Mount Vernon in 1759 at about 16 years old as a part of Martha's dower share of enslaved workers from the Custis estate. He would become a field worker, and as early as 1778, he was supervising other enslaved workers. Washington had 5 farms, and most of the overseers were hired whites. But like Davy, a handful of men would rise up to this position of authority. At one point, 3 of the 5 farms had enslaved overseers. As an overseer, Davy would have been responsible for supervising the day-to-day happenings of their fields and ensuring that the enslaved workers were performing their assigned tasks thoroughly. It also would have been Davy's responsibility to administer any punishments. Washington stated, "Davy at Muddy Hole carries on his business as well as the white overseers, and with more quietness than any of them, with proper direction he will do very well." Many of the men that Washington hired out did not meet his standards. They would be caught drinking too much, oversleeping, and neglecting their duties. As an overseer, Davy would have had more privileges. He received leather breeches instead of coarse linen, the occasional cash gift, as well as a house with a brick chimney instead of the standard wooden chimney that he shared with his wife. He was also able to advocate for his fellow workers. One instance of this would have been when Washington's new method of distributing cornmeal was leaving everyone with less to eat. Davy advocated for himself and others by changing Washington's view on the distribution method. Davy was among the hired enslaved workers that were outfitted in mourning clothes for Washington's funeral. Both Davy and his wife Molly were owned by the Custis estate, so they were not freed after Washington's death. The third person I will highlight will be Doll. Doll first arrived at Mount Vernon at 38 years old with her children as a part of the Custis estate. Doll was the estate cook for many years. It is thought that Martha had installed Doll as the estate cook due to Martha being familiar with her skills. As Mount Vernon became a place to host many guests, Doll would have been one to prepare and cook large and elaborate meals. As the estate cook, she would have worked closely with Martha to plan daily menus and maintain stocks of ingredients. The kitchen would be Doll's domain, and she would pass down her cooking skills to her daughter Lucy, who would also be an estate cook. As Doll aged, she likely worked less and less in the kitchen and more on assisting people with knitting and mending. These were tasks reserved for elderly enslaved people. Doll was also matriarch to one of the largest extended families within Mount Vernon. In 1799, she had 5 children, 14 grandchildren, and at least 4 great-grandchildren. Doll was a part of the Custis estate and would have been 82 years old when she would have been inherited by one of Martha's grandchildren. Sources for this episode include George Washington's Mount Vernon website, history.com, and Wikipedia. I would like to note that nowhere in the George Washington summary on the White House website does it mention anything about slavery. It is a very short and brief summary of George Washington, but I mean, it's the official White House website. I would like to think that we could at least mention something as impactful as slavery. And on that note, I would like to thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, please follow and or leave a review. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, please email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com with no apostrophe. Thanks again, and I hope to have you in the next one.